I'm very pleased to introduce our speaker for today. We have got Austin, who is the Bioresource and Research and Innovation Laboratory Operations Manager. Over to you, Austin.
Afternoon all. So I will share my screen. Now, apologies in advance. I think when I share the presentation, I can't see anyone, so it'll be like talking to my screen. So if there is anything, please just say something and interrupt me. Um, can everyone see that?
Yes, we can.
Yeah, amazing. So, I'm going to talk about my experience on the Leo course. So that's the Leading and Empowered Organization. So I did Leo. So a bit of a background. I'm quite new to working within an NHS organization. So I joined the trust back in 2023 as the laboratory manager at the time, and kind of it was a completely new role for me and for R&I because there wasn't a lab manager beforehand. So I think my main task was to kind of build up that service and kind of like to be able to support the delivery of clinical trials. So coming in, having not worked within an NHS organization, it was quite new to me, and especially working within a clinical setting because obviously I'm labs by background, so I've always worked in with other lab people and within industry. So having to work with clinical peers was something that was very strange for me. So all that's to say, I think going on I think I went on the Leo course, I think about 4 months into my role. So I think Leo came at a very good time for me, and it really, really helped me kind of understand, well, give me a framework to understand where I am, what the task I had in terms of building that service, and to be able to articulate and make a plan in terms to actualize kind of the vision we had for the service coming into the role. So just to give a bit of technical difficulties. Yeah, so just to give a bit of a background on the Leo framework. So this is kind of the Leo framework, as they call it, the triangle. So right in the middle, you've got ownership. So I think with Leo, it's about each individual within an organization taking ownership of what they have control over. It's having that ownership of wanting to make a change, not leaving things for other people, but being able to assess your surroundings, looking at things that could be improved, and is about that continuous improvement and continuous development. Um, I'm going to talk about it based on. I'm going to kind of go through my learnings from Leo based on the case study and how I implemented it in practice. So hopefully I can touch on different bits of the framework, and it'll make a bit more for some bit more sense in practice, and then I can kind of summarize at the end as well. So R&I Laboratories, when I came in, we needed to kind of like look at the service from ground up, and there were a few areas, or 5 areas that we identified that needed focus. So that was the facilities and infrastructure, the staffing, policies and processes, the procurement, and equipment. However, I think the main thing that was highlighted um, within that process was the policies and processes. So that I believe at the time was the foundation and the starting point in terms of looking at what that service would look like. As part of the Leo course, so when I went on to Leo, we had to do kind of like a project at the end of the course, and I picked this because I felt that it would give me the best learning outcome, and I could actually use what I've learned to actually kickstart or get an early win within my role. So one thing that Leo was good for was being able to understand identifying what the problems are, being able to then, within that problem, understand what your responsibility to fix that problem is, what authority you had to kind of tackle that problem, and then what accountability. So who were the key stakeholders? Who were the key stakeholders in relation to that problem or that change you're trying to affect, and what the accountability between you and the key stakeholders were. So just as I mentioned, my focus was on policies and processes for R&I laboratories. So the first thing that Leo tends to teach you is obviously identifying the problem. So the problem we had at the time was we didn't have a laboratory service before. Now, samples were being processed by clinical teams who were working in silos. Obviously, within research innovation, we have our different areas, and teams kind of worked in silo in that sense. So they would process their own samples. That meant that there wasn't a standardized process for it. Some departments, so for example, like respiratory, were able to hire some lab staff because of the complexity of the lab processes that were being carried out, whereas other departments, because they didn't have that much complex processing, they were expected to process the samples on by themselves. So the issue that created then was you had within R&I different pockets where everyone was pretty much doing the right thing in a sense, that no one was actually going out of their way to make mistakes or whatever, but we didn't have a standardized process. There wasn't kind of that dependability where you could step in and support someone else with it from a different department with processing the samples. There wasn't standardized SOPs, risk assessments, all the kind of things you would expect from a laboratory setting. So that was kind of the main problem that we identified, or I identified. Then the next bit was to look at who was actually impacted by the problem. So as I mentioned, clinical teams were undertaking laboratory work that they might have not entirely felt confident carrying out, because I think at the time there wasn't a standardized training process in place. So it was kind of like a see one, do one, teach one kind of approach to it. So it was kind of, you kind of learned from the last person, and there wasn't kind of like evidence to support that training as such. So that was kind of one of the big problems. Trial outcomes as well. So samples may not have always been handled or processed according to trial protocols, which obviously can impact the data that was produced. So having identified the problem, the next bit was to assess what my level of authority was for solving the problem. Obviously, coming in as the laboratory um, manager, I believed I had the understanding and the knowledge and experience to know what's needed from a laboratory setting. So I could, if I felt well, I could go in and say, okay, this is how I think things should be done, and kind of go about putting those things in place. However, within Leo, what I came to understand was there are different level of authority to solving the problem, and I felt that having access to different level, I think it goes from level 1 to 4. I felt that I my authority fell within level 3 or 4, but I didn't have the right information to come to a conclusion on exactly what course of action to take. So obviously data, information, ideas gathering, recommendation, pause to communicate, clarify, and negotiate before acting, or act and inform others after taking action. So in order to decide what level of authority or how to approach the problem, um, the next thing we did was a problem analysis. So through Leo, we were taught to first of all reflect on our own practices and how we contribute to this problem, or what approach we take to that problem. So through that reflection, I realized that I had approached the situation, as I mentioned earlier, with a preconceived idea of what the solution should be or is, based on my previous role, based on my experience, or based on the fact that I've been hired as a lab manager to come in and implement a service. Um, that my preconceived idea of what that solution should be was was adding to the problem. What I needed to do was then reflect on that and see how I could work around that. So next bit I looked at was what part of this was mine to own, what part of the problem was mine, and what part was ours, as in the wider RNI to own. So what I did then was I had to review current practices by visiting the different teams. I spent a lot of time shadowing staff from different research groups that were processing samples. I think the main thing and the main outcome out of that exercise was building those relationships, because I think one of the most important things with trying to affect change within an organization or within a group of people is making sure that you have a strong foundation in with the relationships. There's no point trying to drive change when you're kind of like an island working in silo and expect people to kind of just follow you or accept what you're saying, when you haven't taken the time to understand things from their point of view, taking the time to understand how they work, and build those lasting relationships which will not just help you enact those changes at the initial stage, but also help you kind of like continue in that change to because I think with change it's something that happens over a long period of time. It's all good and well writing a set of SOPs or producing a pro um, SOPs and processes, but if you don't have that relationship to kind of like effectively communicate, articulate expectations, then it kind of falls flat at the first hurdle. Which leads me on to, sorry, again, I expect the staff to understand that I'm not here to point out mistakes or bad practices, but to improve processes and practice for the collective. So that goes back to kind of that interdependability of the process. And that's, again, something that Leo was really kind of honed in, that we're only good as the team that we work in. So if being able to build those relationships, being able to communicate effectively, articulate expectations effectively, it then means that there's an understanding between all parties and all stakeholders, and then everyone's working collectively for towards one goal, rather than fighting or friction being arising, which kind of again doesn't help when you're trying to enact change. And then we looked at, is there any other data that are needed by to is there any other data needed by this group to solve the problem? So what we did was we reviewed the current lab processes. So the teams that did have some sort of working instructions for the lab, that did have lab processes, the teams that had lab staff, we looked at what those processes were, and then we also then discussed with the different research groups on how that would look like for them. So I think one of the biggest learning for me is that although within R&I, we kind of work on clinical trials, but different departments work different ways because of maybe how the department's set up. For example, hematology, they're based within a really fast-paced environment where they're kind of embedded within the clinical setting. So there's a high need for like a high turnover of sample processing. Things are quite fast paced. Whereas if we compare it to, I don't know, the adult CRF at QMC, things are a bit slower paced. There's time to we have a dedicated lab there. There's a bit more time to process the samples. So what might work for the lab over the CRF might not work for the hematology team. So trying to come off of a process and policies that kind of one size fits all wasn't going to work for anyone. But again, if I hadn't taken the time to analyze the problem, I would have come in and said, well, we need a category 2 laboratory. This is what the regulations of the guidelines says that needs to be in a category 2 laboratory. So we need to follow that to the letter. However, there is always nuances to that based on the requirement of the service. So it's taking that time to analyze the problem and making sure that, yes, while you need to follow regulations and be compliant, you also need to ensure that that compliance works for the groups of people that you are putting policies and processes in place for. So once all that kind of background work was done, the next part of kind of like the Leo process is, what are your options and action plan? So I then had to revisit what my level of authority for problem solving was again. So going back to that kind of level 3, level 4 decision, I think I felt that based on kind of the fact finding, my authority was at level three. So it was about data, information, idea gathering, and recommendations. Obviously, we've paused to communicate, clarify, negotiate, and now it's kind of time to act on the information that we had. So process improvement methods. One thing that I learned was I learned what works well. So collecting stories of best practices. I think it's really important not to rush to the first idea for solution. Again, like I said at the very start, I came in to the role with an understanding of what was needed or what I believed was needed to make a successful laboratory service. However, having not worked within a NHS trust or an organization as like NUH, it was imperative that I paused, spoke to those who had been here for a very long time, who knew the process, the established processes. I think, again, another big part of it was understanding the culture. I think when you're trying to enact change, understanding the culture around you is really important. Sometimes I think there, as humans, we're quite restrictive to change, and it takes time because it's always a thing about the unknown. So it's not that people don't want to change, but it's communicating and understanding and making them understand that this is for the best this is for the best for the best purpose, for the best outcome, and maybe sometimes doing a trial. And I think what I found was once I had those communications, once I had that kind of level of discussion with different teams, and they saw um, the things I was trying to put in place, there was a bit more, that people were a lot more receptive. And it takes, I think for me, or from what I experienced, it takes one person to kind of like lead, adopt those changes. And once people see it in practice, they're more likely to follow, because once they see that, yes, this works, not just theoretically, but in practice, it actually works and it makes life a lot easier. People are a lot more willing to then to kind of fall into that new status quo. Um, and involving a team of people closest to the impact. I think that's something that I learned quite early in my career, especially as a manager. Um, it's all good and well having the theoretical knowledge and knowing how things should work in practice, but to be able to actually impact change, lasting change, it needs to I think change needs to be led by the people on the shop floor. Um, and you have to empower them to take ownership of that change. Again, that was something that Leo really emphasized. It's that ownership at the center of that model. It's that ownership, regardless of where you are in the hierarchy. We all have ownership of the parts of kind of like the wheel or the cog in terms of our day-to-day role. So relating this back to kind of the projects at hand, it was getting the clinical nurses, the CRPs, those who were actively processing the samples to one either review the SOPs, write um, write some parts of the SOPs, and making sure that what was being written actually works for them. So having that kind of shared governorship and kind of decentralization of the process meant that what was being the processes and the policies that were being written, that we were trying to implement actually worked for everybody. And again, it encourages kind of like differences of opinion and multiple perspective. Because again, coming in as someone who has never worked within an NHS organization or within a kind of like a clinical research department, I have kind of a narrow view of what would work. So again, working with my colleagues, my peers, and kind of like in different specialities helps to kind of make the process again, make the process that works for everyone, making sure the processes work for everyone, and making sure that things that I might have overlooked um, might be picked up by someone else, just to make sure again that whatever we have or whatever change that we're trying to enact is going to be lasting and it's going to work for everyone. So kind of just to recap, again, going back to the Leo model, I think the main thing, if we're looking at it from like ground up, um, the main thing is when you identify a problem, it's making sure that everyone involved knows is empowered to take ownership of the work that they do. There's no silly ideas. There's no I always tell my team there's no silly ideas. If you feel like there's something that can be done better, please let me know. And I'm happy for you to kind of run with that. Create a project out of that and then come back with kind of gather feedback and come back with how we can implement it because a service that is constantly evolving is a service that's constantly reflecting on their practices and making sure that the things that they're doing is it's one regulatory compliance. I mean, we're working in a environment where the regulations are constantly changing. We're working, I mean, clinical research is a fast-paced environment, so there is a need for us to constantly evolve and constantly change. There's also a need for us to constantly innovate. I think that's one of the things that we always miss when we say research and innovation, that the innovation part of it is a lot of the time is missing. So having a service that is constantly innovating and innovating in the sense of how we do things. There's always a better way to do things. There's always something that you can kind of tweak to make things a little bit better. So it's again taking that ownership of the process or an identified problem is understanding what your responsibilities are um, within within that problem. What your part is in creating that problem or amplifying that problem. What your authority is in changing that is understanding, okay, I might not feel like I have the authority to um, change it, such as maybe write a new process and implement that. However, I have the authority to take this to the key stakeholder and identify and highlight that problem so that they can then take it on and maybe enact that change, and also being accountable to one another. Looking at the main kind of like triangle, obviously ownerships is the center of that, and within that, the main things in order to when we say leading an empower organization, enacting change, obviously developing capacity. I think one of the things that I found was I couldn't do everything on my own. And at the time, we didn't have the lab team that we had at the moment. So what I really needed to do was rely on the clinical team, the clinical staff around me, the different specialities, because everyone comes with different experiences. Everyone comes with different kind of knowledge, and is in order to enact change, you need I'm just kind of like a small part of kind of a bigger circle. I need all the different parts to make a whole. So it's being able to understand that we need to work collaboratively to be able to to enact change. Lead change, you need to be able to problem solve. I think that was one of the things that I found. I thought I would come in and kind of like, okay, this is what we need to do because this is what the guidelines state, and everyone be on board and it would be happy days and we'll have change. But what you don't realize is there's a lot of obstacles, and not because people want or are opposed to change or opposed to good change. It's I think a lot of the time we get comfortable in if it's been done this way for so long and there hasn't been an issue as such, why do we need to change? Is being able to confront those kind of questions and say, well, yes, I understand that there's nothing essentially wrong with it, but also that this is not the best way to do it. We could be a bit more, what's the word, efficient. We could always squeeze a little bit more if we do things slightly differently. So again, it's being able to problem process, and that then helps with like um, creating that commitment to lasting change. Um, yeah, and I think at the top of it all is articulating expectations. It's all great. I think that's something that even up till now that I still have to keep going back and doing. So it's all great having a process. We have now for a few years a standardized process. We have a suite of SOPs, we have policies, we have all these things in place, but it's in order to maintain that level and to build on top of that and to make things better, you always have to constantly articulate your expectations. There's a massive, that we have quite a high staff turnover, new people come in, people leave. So it's kind of a continuous circle. I don't think, and that's another thing that kind of Leo taught me, I don't think it's something that change um, in a whole. It's not something that you just do once and once you have the building blocks in place, you're expected to kind of kick on its own. It's something that you have to constantly work on. It's something that you have to constantly talk to people about. You have to articulate those expectations. We have to learn from our previous experience. We have to learn from the things that go well, the things that don't go so well. Um, so it's always a constant it's a constant feedback loop in order for us to generate lasting change and to have what we call an empowered organization. And I think that is pretty much it from me. If I can, yeah, so that's it for my presentation. If anyone had any questions surrounding that, thank you.
Rakesh, you've got your hand out. Do you want to ask a question?
Yeah, thank you. This is a brilliant presentation. In fact, Austin, it's not just the what you learned from the Leo course that you implemented in your workplace. Besides, you have also illustrated a big theme here, which is the change management. How did you manage the change? So change management, obviously, it's something people you already mentioned and realized that the people resist, and and I was kind of when you were speaking, I was able to recall every step of the change process that you actually did successfully. So in fact, majority of the change processes fail.
Yeah,
But this time this was a brilliant thing, I think, that you carried out. So this is more of a reflection than a question. Kudos to you. Brilliant
thank you.
job.
Thank you very much, Rakesh.
Yeah.
Does anybody else have any questions for Austin while we've got him? Lindsay.
Hi, Austin. I'll echo what Rakesh said. It was a great presentation. I was reflecting on the change management projects I'm working on and what I might be able to do to get that engagement and sort of support staff through that change. A question I've got actually is, did you see much resistance to that change? Did you have sort of conversations with staff around understanding of that change, and how was that? Could you explain that a little bit if you did?
Yeah, so I think one of the biggest stumbling block was the resistance to the change. So I think I alluded to it a bit. Like I said, I don't think anyone was opposed to change because they just was opposed to the change. I think the biggest question that or the biggest feedback that I got was we haven't had any kind of like serious adverse events, or we haven't had any issues as such arising from the way we currently do things. So why is there a need for change? And it's hard, it's easy to enact change when something goes wrong, but it's hard to enact change when things seem to go right. And it was being able to articulate that, well, these are the guidelines that we have. These are the regulatory, what we need to be regulatory compliant. Yes, nothing has gone wrong yet. However, we might not be following best practices. So even having articulated that as best as I can, I think one of the biggest wins for me was being able to have kind of like a trial period where we made some of those changes, not everything at once, but once people started to see the benefits of those changes, they're like, oh, okay, I understand now why we need to do things a bit differently. So I think the hardest thing is to get that one person on board. But once you have that one person on board, it's kind of like a domino effect where you then start get I mean I've like I said I kind of because I wasn't expecting things to change as quickly as they did, but once we had one department, I think the biggest win for us was the oncology department. Once we were able to get them on board, we were then becoming inundated with work where other departments were saying, oh, I see what you guys are doing over here, can you support me with this tracking? So, and then we were like, well, we actually don't have the staff to do all of that. Yeah, we're kind of like taking things slow, step by step. But again, it's being able to one have those articulate that expectation. And I think the biggest thing there was trust, and it had to go both ways. The team trusted us to take on their sample processing because again they had ownership of that. They cared about that work, so they didn't want to kind of like give it away to someone else to process, and maybe issues will arise from that. So they needed to trust us that we knew what we were doing, and we needed to trust them and repay that trust by carrying out the work that they expected us to carry out. So I think that was the biggest thing there, was articulating expectations, having those kind of like building that relationship and having trust that everything will work out.
Fab, thank you. It's interesting that you should mention trust, because I was thinking it's amazing the psychological safety that you incite as a leader, and actually you were expressing there that actually that it might not work, but let's give it a go, and we can always change things if anything needs to be changed, and having that trial period, which I think I'll take something from as well within my project. So that's great. Thank you.
You're welcome. Rakesh?
Yeah, so I was just wondering, in this Leo course that you took and that you undertook, do they also teach you about change management, like Kotter's principles, 6 or 7 principles they have, or it's just, I mean, what I mean to say is, did you have any prior knowledge of Kotter's principle of change management before you began the process of this change?
I think I did have some experience with change management, but I think what the Leo course really amplified was, and I might have not spoke about a lot of it because it's a 3-day course, so trying to summarize everything in a presentation is quite hard. But there was a lot of kind of the concept of having those conversations, like it's like part of the framework is like building relationship, empowering people. So there's a lot of change management embedded within the course itself, and that really allowed me to, or rather that empowered me to be able to kind of approach things how I approached it. Like I mentioned, like I came in and yes, I had an understanding of the steps to take to um, get where I needed to get, but what Delio course did really well was conceptualize it within the healthcare environment. I think that's the biggest thing. It's really put together for the environment that we work in, rather than, because there's loads of other versions of the Leo course that are more maybe for that apply more to private entities or whatnot. But I think the course that is offered here at NUH, it's very much tailored to the environment that we work in.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Anybody else got any questions? Okay, thank you so much, Austin, for sharing your insights and for such a clear and practical overview of how you've applied your accredited learning to your role.
Thanks, Lisa.
Yeah, that's a pleasure. It was a really great presentation. And finally, just to flag that the next session in this series will take place on Wednesday, the 13th of May. So keep your eyes open for the invite for the next one. Austin is our only speaker today due to availability, but we've got 2 people speaking on the next couple of sessions. So thank you ever so much, Austin, and everybody else for joining today. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Take care all. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.